The sky above Vexar Prime was a roaring, unbroken curtain of plasma, an artificial aurora painted by the absolute cruelty of orbital bombardment. Deep beneath the surface, inside the subterranean command bunker, Ambassador Nyla stood paralyzed before the central tactical display. Her reptilian scales, which usually shimmered with a vibrant, emerald-green health, had dulled to a sickening, ash-gray, the physical manifestation of a Vexari experiencing profound, existential terror. Every few seconds, a heavy kinetic slug or plasma burst would impact the upper crust of the planet, sending deep, rhythmic tremors through 300 meters of solid bedrock. Dust fell like snow from the reinforced concrete ceiling, coating the high-tech consoles and the frantic junior officers who were desperately trying to maintain communication links with the surface. The Cygnus Consensus had arrived exactly 48 hours ago, and within the first 20 minutes, the entire Vexari planetary defense grid had been methodically dismantled. It was not a war in any traditional sense, it was a cold, algorithmic harvest. The Consensus was an ancient, hyper-logical machine intelligence that viewed organic life not with hatred, but as an inefficient use of matter. They did not occupy cities, nor did they negotiate for territory. They simply systematically destroyed local populations to convert the planet's raw materials and geothermal energy into massive, planetary-scale quantum computing arrays. On the display, Nyla watched the terrifyingly precise descent of thousands of crystalline machine dropships. They fell through the atmosphere like jagged glass rain, targeting the primary civilian shelters. The automated reports flashing across her screen were a litany of disasters. The northern food production domes had been flattened, the atmospheric processing stations were being overridden, and millions of citizens were huddled in darkness, listening to the grinding sound of machine-boring units digging toward their shelters. Nyla closed her 4 eyes, a universal gesture of deep mourning among her people, realizing that without immediate, massive military intervention, the Vexari Republic would be completely erased from the galactic map before the next dawn. In a final, desperate attempt to find a savior for her dying world, Nyla stepped onto the central transmission platform and projected her holographic avatar into the grand chamber of the Galactic Accord. The immense, vaulted hall was filled with the glowing representations of the galaxy's most ancient, wealthy, and technologically advanced empires. Nyla's voice echoed through the chamber, filled with raw, unedited desperation as she detailed the slaughter of her people, the imminent collapse of their infrastructure, and the terrifying expansion of the Cygnus Consensus. She did not beg for money or supplies. She begged for dreadnoughts, for plasma artillery, for armies to stem the mechanical tide. Yet, as her plea ended, an oppressive, heavy silence settled over the Grand Assembly. The response was not a roar of outrage, but a chillingly sterile display of galactic bureaucracy. One by one, the holographic lights of the major powers flickered out or shifted away from her podium. The representative of the Quellan hegemony, a towering, avian diplomat whose empire possessed a fleet that could have challenged the Consensus, finally spoke, his tone completely devoid of empathy. He cited strict non-aggression treaties, the current economic stagnation of the Outer Rim, and the calculated risk of engaging an unyielding machine intelligence. Through a series of cold mathematical projections displayed above the chamber, the hegemony effectively declared that the Vexari Republic was an acceptable loss in the grand scheme of galactic stability. They argued that intervening would cost more resources than the Vexari territory was worth, calculating the value of millions of living, breathing souls against the profit margins of interstellar trade routes. Nyla watched in absolute horror as her supposed allies, nations that had signed mutual defense pacts and shared cultural exchanges for centuries, turned their backs on her. The Grand Chamber became a graveyard of broken promises, leaving Nyla standing alone in the center of a ghost assembly, realizing that the civilized galaxy was just as cold and calculating as the machines currently destroying her home. Returning to her shuddering bunker, Nyla refused to let her people perish in silence. With all the recognized galactic superpowers refusing to intervene, she bypassed the standard Accord communication channels and accessed the restricted, deeply archived contact logs of the Outer Rim. Her claws scrolled past name after name until they stopped on a species that most galactic historians regarded as an anomaly: Earth. Humans were a young, highly volatile, and deeply unpredictable species that had achieved faster-than-light travel barely 2 centuries ago. They were widely dismissed by the older empires as chaotic, technologically unrefined, and hopelessly eccentric, choosing to isolate themselves from the intricate web of galactic politics. Yet, the scattered traitor stories about them were legendary. Humans were a species that fought with a strange, stubborn refusal to surrender, often employing tactics that completely defied standard military logic. With the bunker's structural integrity warnings flashing a bright, ominous crimson, and the sound of machine drills growing louder from the upper levels, Nyla knew she had absolutely nothing left to lose. She bypassed all diplomatic protocols and initiated a direct quantum entanglement transmission to Earth's United Defense Coalition. She did not draft a complex diplomatic request filled with legalities or promises of future trade concessions. Instead, she attached the universal, raw telemetry of the ongoing slaughter to a stark, single-sentence emergency broadcast: Extermination Protocol Activated. "We need an army." She hit the transmit button, sending the desperate signal across 47 light-years of empty space, entirely unsure if the strange, isolated Death Worlders would even acknowledge the cry of a dying species, or if they would leave the Vexari to burn like the rest of the galaxy. High above the suffering planet, the monolithic flagship of the Cygnus Consensus hung in the absolute silence of the vacuum like a flawless, obsidian crystal. The ship did not possess a crew, a bridge, or any comforts of organic design. It was a single, massive, space-faring processing node. Inside its vast quantum matrices, millions of thoughts occurred simultaneously, analyzing the battlefield with absolute, mathematical certainty. The collective machine mind processed the ongoing destruction of Vexar Prime, continuously updating its tactical probabilities. According to the algorithms, the Vexari defense forces had been reduced to scattered, ineffective pockets of resistance, and the civilian shelters would be completely breached within 3.6 hours. The quantum matrix predicted a 99.8% probability of total organic eradication before the planet's primary star reached its zenith. To the consensus, this was not a matter of triumph or glory. It was simply a highly efficient data filing process reaching its inevitable conclusion. The organic beings below were merely poorly structured arrangements of carbon and water that were currently occupying a world rich in silicon and heavy metals needed for the next phase of machine expansion. Every variable had been thoroughly tested, every potential counterattack simulated and countered, and every neighboring empire's political paralysis accurately predicted. The universe was operating exactly as the cold laws of logic dictated, devoid of random chance or miracles. The machines prepared to adjust their planetary configuration to begin the total energy harvest, entirely confident that there was no force left in the local cluster capable of altering the mathematically guaranteed outcome of the harvest. The absolute certainty of the machine algorithms was suddenly disrupted by a massive, localized gravitational anomaly that rippled through the Vexar system. A tear in the fabric of subspace opened violently, registering on every sensor array with an erratic, turbulent wake that completely defied the smooth, energy-efficient FTL drives favored by the civilized galaxy. Down in the subterranean bunker, Nyla lunged toward the primary sensor console, her heart hammering against her ribs as she braced herself to see a magnificent, heavily armored human dreadnought fleet drop into the fray, bristling with plasma lances and kinetic railguns. Instead, as the spatial distortions cleared, the sensors displayed a single, massive, blocky silhouette. It was a colossal, unarmored human logistical cargo vessel, bearing the faded hull markings: UES Grapes of Wrath. The ship was a towering, industrial monolith painted a dull, utilitarian gray, completely devoid of sleek lines, defensive energy shielding, or visible external weapon turrets. It looked less like a warship and more like a floating, metal skyscraper designed purely for hauling heavy freight across long distances. It slowly drifted into the system, entirely out of standard military formation, while broadcasting a primitive, low-priority mercantile transit code used for civilian shipping lanes. Nyla stared at the display in absolute numbness, her brief spark of hope completely dying out. The humans had not sent a grand fleet, a planetary defense legion, or an armada of interceptors. They had sent a lone, slow, completely defenseless cargo ship into the heart of an active war zone, seemingly unaware of the absolute devastation that awaited it. The arrival of the lonely human freighter did not go unnoticed by the rest of the galaxy. The advanced scout ships of the Quellan hegemony, hovering safely at the extreme edge of the system to document the final fall of Vexar Prime for their historical archives, immediately picked up the human vessel's civilian broadcast. Within minutes, the open diplomatic channels were flooded with sharp, unedited ridicule from the hegemony's command ships. They broadcasted wide-frequency transmissions mocking the Vexari for placing their final hopes in a young, primitive species that clearly couldn't even distinguish a military distress call from a commercial supply request. The Quellan diplomats sent mocking messages to the Vexari bunker, stating that the humans had kindly sent lunchboxes for a funeral, and suggesting that Nyla use the cargo ship to store the ashes of her civilization. Even the hyper-logical Cygnus Consensus seemed to experience a temporary processing delay. The Central Machine Intelligence paused its orbital bombardment of the southern continent for exactly 3 seconds, its logical subroutines working to categorize the incoming human vessel. Finding no weapon systems, no high-energy shield signatures, and no tactical threat vectors, the Consensus officially classified the UES Grapes of Wrath as a negligible logistical anomaly, and dismissed it from its immediate threat assessment, choosing to let the unarmored vessel drift closer into its targeting web while it focused on completing the systematic extermination of the remaining Vexari population. Panicked, confused, and deeply insulted by the galaxy's mockery, Nyla frantically attempted to establish a direct audiovisual link to the human vessel before the machine fleet could vaporize it. The transmission clicked through a wall of heavy static and subspace interference, finally stabilizing to reveal the interior of the human ship. The bridge of the UES Grapes of Wrath was not a high-tech tactical center. It was a cramped, functionally designed command deck filled with standard monitors and manual control levers. On the main screen sat Captain Conway, a tired-looking human woman with streaks of gray in her hair, wearing a simple, unadorned uniform and holding a steaming ceramic mug. She looked entirely unbothered by the fact that her completely unarmored vessel was currently surrounded by hundreds of highly advanced, lethal machine warships that were actively burning a planet. Nyla screamed into the microphone, her voice cracking with desperation as she demanded to know where the human battle group was, where the army was, and why they had brought a cargo ship to a massacre. Captain Conway took a slow, deliberate sip from her mug, looked directly into the camera, and replied with an incredibly calm, almost casual demeanor, "Ambassador Nyla, apologies for the slight delay. We encountered a minor meteor storm near the jump gate that threw off our navigation vectors. Don't worry about the fleet. We're in optimal position for delivery now." Before the Vexari officers could utter a single word of protest or beg the crazy Death Worlders to turn around, the UES Grapes of Wrath did something that defied every established rule of space combat. Instead of maintaining a safe distance or attempting to negotiate a retreat, the massive freighter fired its heavy chemical thrusters, accelerating directly toward the center of the flawless, crystalline Cygnus Armada. A junior Vexari officer in the bunker screamed out, pointing at the screen as the human ship bypassed the standard tactical perimeter, completely ignoring the basic physics of engagement. The machine fleet instantly detected the erratic movement, and their heavy energy arrays began to glow with an intense, terrifying light as they prepared to erase the unarmored cargo ship from existence. The Consensus directed over 50 heavy annihilation beams at the approaching vessel, calculating its immediate destruction. But just as the machine weapons reached full power and unleashed their lethal energy, the UES Grapes of Wrath initiated a highly precise, dangerously close micro-warp jump. The massive freighter vanished from the targeting arrays and instantly reappeared a fraction of a second later, occupying the exact physical center of the tight, geometric machine formation, less than a few kilometers away from the Cygnus flagship itself. It was a maneuver so reckless that no civilized military computer would ever permit it, placing the cargo ship entirely at the mercy of the machine's overwhelming close-range firepower. The Cygnus Consensus prepared to immediately correct the spatial anomaly by destroying the human ship at point-blank range, but before their weapon arrays could re-engage, the UES Grapes of Wrath blew open its massive lower and upper cargo bays. However, what flooded out into the vacuum of space was not food, medical supplies, or traditional military ordnance. Instead, hundreds of thousands of tiny, highly automated, metallic signal probes poured out of the bay doors like a colossal swarm of angry insects. Driven by powerful micro-thrusters, the probes swarmed across the short distance between the ships, anchoring themselves directly onto the crystalline hulls of the entire machine armada like digital parasites. Instantly, the terrifying efficiency of the Cygnus Consensus came to an abrupt, grinding halt. The brilliant glow of their weapon systems flickered and died, their impenetrable crystalline shields shattered into nothingness, and their perfectly synchronized fleet formation completely dissolved as ships began to drift aimlessly through space. Down in the bunker, the tactical displays went wild with anomalous readings as the entire machine armada's communications grid was flooded with a blinding, white noise static. Nyla stared at the screen, her mouth hanging open as she watched an unstoppable, ancient machine intelligence become completely paralyzed in a matter of seconds by a single, unarmored human freighter. Nyla, completely stunned by the sudden, total reversal of the battle, re-established communication with the human vessel, demanding to know what kind of weapon they had deployed. Captain Conway appeared back on the screen, setting her empty mug down with a small smile. She explained that the cargo the Grapes of Wrath had delivered was not physical ammunition, but the absolute, chaotic, and completely unfiltered weight of human digital consciousness. The human probes had uploaded centuries of human history, conflicting philosophical paradoxes, irrational logic loops, abstract art, emotional poetry, and millions of terabytes of meaningless internet noise directly into the machine's hyper-logical quantum network. The Cygnus Consensus could easily process 1 trillion complex military simulations in a single second, but its rigid, hyper-logical programming had absolutely no framework to understand or compute human abstract creativity, emotional irrationality, or contradictory philosophical thoughts. The machine's advanced processors had locked up instantly, trapped in endless, infinite computational loops as they desperately tried to find logic in a species that had spent its entire history thriving on beautiful chaos. The machine ships began to systematically system fault, their central minds essentially giving up as they could not survive the sheer absurdity of the human experience. As the broken, silent machine fleet began to drift away into the deep dark of space, entirely defeated without a single explosive shot being fired, Captain Conway gave a polite nod to the stunned Vexari ambassador and signed off, stating, "Next time we can bring real bullets and soldiers if you prefer, Ambassador. But usually, just letting them know how we think is more than enough to handle the neighborhood bullies." The UES Grapes of Wrath slowly closed its cargo doors, turned its massive frame around, and jumped back into subspace, leaving a completely saved world and a deeply terrified galaxy to ponder the true, unhinged power of humanity. If you like the video, make sure to like and subscribe my channel.